introduced, Professor Yannick Kluch. I'm always can never pronounce it exactly correctly, so you're going to have to help me on this, Yannick.
Oh, you're fine. It's Kluch. You're good. You're good.
Yeah, we've been doing a million things, and I keep trying to get it right. But Yannick is a professor at the Virginia Commonwealth University, director of Inclusive Excellence in the Center for Sport Leadership. Yannick is amazing in his work. Recently leading and being a part of the task force on social justice for the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee as one of the few experts to that council, and particularly his work aiding the steering committee on athlete protests and also on demonstrations, as well as his various other work and his work this summer in connection to the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics, which I'm going to ask him to share as well. We also have Charley Nordin, a silver medalist from Tokyo. So it's awesome to have Charley here just off the Paralympic Games. And he's now studying he's actually joining us from Dublin, which is awesome, where he's studying social change. And so we definitely want to hear more about interests. And then you mentioned your interest particularly in the local communities and youth engagement. So that'll be awesome to hear about that. And then we have Moushaumi, legendary, amazing Moushaumi. I probably don't even have to give a bio or anything, but I'll just share a little bit of her background. Gold medalist from Athens, a Texas Longhorn, a CEO, mother, educator, coach, so many amazing experiences and stories to share. And she's now, leading as chair of the task force of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee on social justice, and also a member of the Athlete Council, amongst many other leadership roles and experiences. And so really, this is really a dynamic group, really excited about just having this kind of informal, authentic conversation where we can talk together, reflecting on our different experiences and involvements in Tokyo. Also talking through a little bit about the whole concepts of freedom of expression and the right to protest, and then thinking a little bit about the future before we sort of open it up. So for kind of our first round, I would love to kind of just hear from each of you, starting with Yannick, just kind of sharing that experience from your involvement leading up to Tokyo, during Tokyo, kind of some of your reflections around it, maybe even kind of how you got involved in this area. Maybe to kick us off, Yannick, would be wonderful. Turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eli. Thank you so much to UConn for organizing this. I followed this series for a while, and I'm honored to be a part of it, and especially honored to share the stage with the wonderful Moushaumi Robinson and Charley Nordin. So really excited to be here. Moushaumi and I have known each other for like a year and a half, but it feels like we've been doing work for like 20 years just over the past year. So really excited anytime I get to share the stage with her. Okay, let me tell you about how I got involved in this work. So for me, my entry point to Tokyo really started about a year and a half ago when the USOPC was responding to broader issues happening in society in terms of racial and social injustice, and the organization, forming the Team USA Council on Racial and Social Justice, which, as Moushaumi will say, is an athlete-led, group. It's over 40 Team USA athletes and Team USA alumni. And the USOPC was very strategic in making sure that the athletes are in the driver's seat, but also bring on some external experts who have expertise in some of the topics that we wanted to address. Thankfully, I've been doing work on activism, mostly in the US college space for years. So I was connected with the folks at the USOPC. They said, hey, we are really looking for somebody to help the council find a response to Rule 50 and Section 2.2, which, for those of you who don't know, those are the rules in the Olympic and Paralympic movement that say that you can protest very simplified, but that's pretty much the gist of it. So they said, hey, we need, somebody to help articulate that response, work with the athletes in making sure our voice is heard globally on these important issues. So I was really brought to this journey to Tokyo about a year and a half ago when I was appointed to the council. To this day, one of the most rewarding and most challenging things I've done. Moushaumi can share some of the inside information there, but as those of you who do social justice work, it's just very challenging, but also very rewarding because there's very few platforms like the Olympic and Paralympic Games where we can drive systemic change on such a global level. So for me, that started really with being appointed to the council, where my role at first was to be the external expert on the steering committee on protests and demonstrations, where we had a subgroup, a steering committee of the council, including Dr. John Carlos, who is, a giant in the history of protest in the Olympic movement and Paralympic movement. So was really exciting to work with people like him, people like Gwen Berry, Raisin Bowden, who've been kind of central figures in really global discourses surrounding protest in sport, and channeling their voices and the energy that they bring to find a response to Rule 50. So that was my primary role, to just help the athletes articulate their voice. From there, I was promoted to the core team and got to actually work on all the other recommendations coming out of the council. So lots of meaningful work coming there. I'll share more on that later, but that's really where my journey to Tokyo started. And it was really interesting because I'm not an Olympic athlete, nowhere close to being good enough to being an Olympic athlete, but I've always done, activism and sports work and DEI, social justice work. So for me, this is really, an opportunity to support athletes like Charley, like Moushaumi, like Gwen, like Grace, like Dr. Carlos, to elevate their voices and look at some of the structures in place in the global sports community that prevent athletes from using their voice or freely expressing their voice. So that was kind of my entry point to Tokyo. And then leading up to Tokyo, I kind of took this work to the next level, working with scholars across the globe, really, and athletes to put a little bit of pressure on the IOC and IPC leading up to the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games, where we published an open letter that called on the IOC and IPC to not sanction athletes who protest for racial and social justice. So quite a bit of the busy year, a lot of things happening. Happy to dive more into this later, but that was kind of my entry point to Tokyo 2020, 2021. And it's been a very challenging but very rewarding experience. Moushaumi can talk about some of that too, but I'll share some more of that later.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Yannick, and kind of building right into Moushaumi to kind of share her experience, role, involvement, and even some reflections off of Tokyo. So yeah, over to you, Moushaumi.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think this is a remarkable space to have the conversation. And yes, I mean, it has been a tremendous year with Dr. Yannick and the council. I think what's most important is to know how the council began. We started with what we all saw globally with George Floyd. And I think it rocked a globe. I think we saw humans, each other different. I think that was the first time globally we saw each other as humans, void of color. And it called upon the US athletes to really start talking about Rule 50 different when it came to being prepared for the games, and going to Tokyo at the time. And so those of us who we came from all different spaces. It was about 15 to 20 of us who were offline, in a chat, and we were ready to take Rule 51 because we talked about it before in the USOPC, AAC, and we really didn't feel like we were being heard. And when that happened, I mean, organically, we were just like, something has to give, something has to be different. And the USOPC heard us having the conversation. So they created a town hall meeting. And from the conversation, particularly one that rooted in a conversation with the track and field athletes solely on one night, particularly before we had the town hall meeting, to really get an organic perspective, particularly to, have Gwen Berry share a story and have athletes speak to from a very intrinsic space about what it is to speak about, color and race, void of the politics that often gets caught up in the conversation. And so that led to the open-mindedness of bringing us together as athletes and really hearing what athletes wanted. And from that town hall, our CEO, Sarah Hirschland, committed to making a council that didn't just deal with Rule 50 and protest. She really wanted to go deep dive into the USOPC and how we can be better. And so they created the council, and we called upon some of the greatest athletes from all different perspectives and areas of sport. And one of the things I thought was most important about having our experts, when Dr. Yannick came, the depth and rich of knowledge to have from the outside perspective coming in is so important to any organization. And for me, I super vouch for Dr. Yannick. Like I kind of just, I think I remember Dr. Yannick in one meeting after we finished with the first recommendations of our protest. I said, Dr. Yannick, I don't know what your time is like, but you're here for the duration. We have 3 more recommendations, 3 more steering committees. I need you to free up your calendar. I need you all to find the money, however that works. And he has just been a very strong advocate for information, education, awareness, and really not backing off what the council and the athletes have really come to share. He's really bridged the gaps. Our experts have stepped up, him and Dr. Brooks, and have really brought to life the conversation that we've been having for many, many years. So I've been blessed to chair the council. I was appointed to it. It's been an honor to serve in the United States, track and field organization for over 15, 16 years. And I was called into leadership in the USOPC AAC. So when this came about, it was a good transition out of that space with the athletes organically there to lead it to this. I was well prepared. I served on leadership for that year with the leadership. So I had a chance to see at every level what we all needed. And it's just been a blessing to lead us. So I'm honored to have this conversation and share.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think it'll be, great, kind of circling back with both of you and also Charley, also just as we start to have the conversation and thinking about, your reflections on Tokyo, kind of. So we'll get to that. But just having you both and even the relationship that the two of you have, it's awesome to hear your story. So, thank you both. And so we're now going to go ahead and turn it over to Charley. Charley was there in Tokyo and had his, medal winning moment and team experience and his story came forward in a very public way, but also just, learning about his studies and everything that he's doing. So Charley, would you be willing to share a little bit, kind of leading up to Tokyo and kind of your background and a little bit like that? That'd be awesome.
Yeah, totally. First, I just want to say thank you so much. I'm incredibly honored to be on such an amazing panel. Moushaumi and Dr. Yannick, I have been following your work from behind the scenes, greatly appreciative of it. I think it's important to recognize that even as recently back in 2019, the USOPC reprimanded Rayson Bowden and Gwen Berry when they protested at the Pan American Games. So to see such a shift in less than 2 years has been incredible. I know you guys have been at the center of a lot of that work, and I'm so thankful. It's something that I have now benefited from myself. I guess anyway, a little bit about me. I was on the Paralympic team, the Paralympic rowing team. We got a silver medal in Tokyo, and it was a great honor. On the podium, I made the decision to protest the death of Oscar Grant, who was a Bay Area native where I'm from. And in 2009, he was shot and killed by police officers on New Year's Day. He was restrained face down. And it was a really kind of landmark case because it's when technology really began to take a hold in America, and there were a lot of different angles of the shooting from people's cell phones, which again, prior to that had not really been accessible to a lot of people. So it did set a couple precedents. Unfortunately, they weren't great precedents. Justice, in my opinion, was not served. So I brought this protest about because I did want to raise awareness around his death. Going into the games, I kind of was thinking, what do I want it to be about? Because I guess for the people that don't know, when I was on the podium, I unzipped my jacket and had a shirt that said "Justice for Oscar Grant." I kind of toyed with the idea of a Black Lives Matter shirt, but I kind of worried that the people that supported it would say, yes, of course. And the people that didn't would just kind of write it off. So I did want to raise awareness around something that hit close to home. I am from the Bay Area myself. So that's kind of how I've gotten my feet wet as far as the topics of these conversations. And I guess specifically for the IPC, I am one of the first Paralympic athletes to protest on the podium in such a outright way, kind of not leaving any questions. I was definitely clear in my intentions of what I was doing. And still to this day, kind of doing with the legal side of things. There's been an investigation, which is ongoing, and I've been advised not to speak too much about it, but would definitely answer some questions in that regard. But I would, again, like to touch on the USOPC's support of my actions and myself as a whole. It's been incredible. They really have been supportive through all steps of this. They've been walking me through it, helping me with legal issues, helping me write responses. So I think this conversation is really important to have because, again, I do think the USOPC has caught up a fair amount to kind of the, changing world, but the IPC and the IOC still have not, with Rule 50. So it's interesting. I'm really excited to be here. I'd love to answer questions, keep talking. I'm just honored to be with such incredible people. So thank you for having me.
No, that's awesome. No, thanks for kind of kicking it off and sharing, your story and some of the latest kind of thinking. At this point, I wanted to just sort of start to talk with Tokyo in mind, with that context, but also more broadly too, just in terms of our society and our sport culture, kind of this whole conversation about freedom of expression and about the right to protest, and kind of how does that fit into our sports environment, and kind of how do we begin to think about that, and how does it have a rightful place, for in the same ways that society has it then translate into sport, the limits in sport, are there limits? So I wanted to kind of do a round with that in mind, just to kind of dig into that concept a little bit more, where you could speak a little bit more on your Tokyo reflections, what's particularly around the concepts of freedom of expression and right to protest. So I'm going to go ahead and start this round with Yannick. I think Yannick, no, Moushaumi, sorry. I'm going to go with Moushaumi. Moushaumi gets to go first this time around. Yannick, I almost gave it to you again.
What's really amazing, Charley, is to have from the source, what that was like. I mean, that's absolutely what every single meeting was for. And to hear, because we're more than athletes, we are human stories, real experiences. And one of the most awesome things I believe that was important to me in athletes going to Tokyo, and I can tell you, I started my journey out, and Yannick knows, preparing to train for Tokyo to support a nonprofit I've been doing for suicide prevention for teens. And it's amazing how the universe will really grab hold of our life and drive us in a way that fills us up and gets the work done on a very global level, without that being necessarily the plan, but to really have the US athletes, be respected, because my biggest thing about the US Olympian and Paralympian is that by the time we've made it to the Olympic or Paralympic Games, you have seen individuals who live in a country where free will is all around us. And to be able to make decisions every single day that support your goals, support being disciplined, support being successful. I felt that not only was I quite offended that Rule 50 targeted only us, and I have to say targeted because there are 207 nations. They only chose, gestures that our nation did. And so in terms of what really, the premise in which they were founded. And so it was important to me that if US athletes were going to go to Tokyo, that they were seen and heard beyond the sports they represented and the clubs that they came from, or just the country. Because just like Charley said, he's more than rowing. He's more than a Paralympian. He has a dear friend that matters to him, that is a human, and that deserves to be known more than the silver medal. And that was what was important. If we were going to go and represent, it was time. You know, I thought it was a time for us collectively as athletes, but even more so, what did it for me were the athletes stepped up. The athletes were saying, this is, you know what led it, they were saying at the end of the day, as US athletes, no matter if we feel like you should protest on the podium or if we feel like you shouldn't protest on the podium, we do respect the right to expression without punishment. And that was 95% of our collective. And for me, that was all I needed to have the fire to move forward, knowing this is what's important. When we go represent our country, we want to be seen and heard. We want to know that we're more than just an athlete. We are a country of athletes who are respectable. We always represent very well. And I thought it was time that we be seen differently. So for Tokyo, for me, that for Charley, that was why I said every Friday, for all those opportunities, for every other country that got on board and said, this is what's right. This is what makes sports great. This is what unites when we see and hear and know the true essence of how these individuals got there and what that means to them. So for me, that's my Tokyo experience. And then to hear this is like the full circle of hugs and love. So thank you, Charley, for the organic hearing of it.
Yeah, that's awesome, Moushaumi. I think that's really also a way to think about why freedom of expression and the right to protest are so essential, this whole concept of more than an athlete. And so I really appreciate you bringing that kind of forward and articulating that, because I do think that's sort of the essence of how these concepts translate into a sport context. So, but yeah, I'm going to have Charley go next and ask Charley to kind of maybe respond to Moushaumi or share further to kind of keep the conversation going.
Yeah, totally. I mean, my Tokyo experience was definitely incredible, and I did enter it. I mean, for years now, I had kind of been planning some sort of protest. You can ask my parents; it made them so nervous. They were so worried about what I was going to do. But it was something that kind of even pre the USOPC reform after 2019 was something that I was really focused on, and it was honestly something that really motivated me. Because my coach said it, who was a bronze medalist from Barcelona, she said, you win a medal and then you wake up the next day and you have to do your laundry. And there's a lot of truth in the fact of like those moments on the podium, the moments in the village, they are very fleeting. They're very short. So it is important. And she was very supportive because I ran this idea of protesting by her before I did it. She was very supportive of it because at the end of the day, we put so much as athletes, we put so much work in behind the scenes that no one sees. And for a couple weeks, every 4 years, we have a platform to use and we have a voice that we can use to uplift a marginalized community or whatever it be, whatever social change you're passionate about. And the Black Lives Matter movement has touched me deeply from a young age. Again, 2009 was such a huge moment for me. Seeing that happen, I was 11 at the time, seeing Oscar Grant being murdered. So from that point on, it really did shape who I was. And then seeing going into Tokyo that I had the opportunity, should I medal, to have a platform to speak on these issues and to hopefully raise awareness around them, it was incredibly motivating. And I really never had a doubt that it's something that I wanted to do. That being said, the USOPC's response to the changing world and the response to the changing narratives and conversations within the United States was a huge comforter for me, because although I knew that the IPC might not necessarily agree with what I was doing and there might be reparations for whatever should happen, it was, again, really comforting that I knew at the very least the USOPC had my back. And in all honesty, it did make me feel as though the country as a whole had my back, because I think as the Black Lives Matter movement swept across the country in 2020, it was really encouraging to see how many people did come out and speak in support of it. And I think since day one, the Olympic team and the Paralympic team, it is a representation of the United States for good and for bad. And while I was on the podium, I was representing the US. And part of the US is that deep-rooted racism, police brutality, systemic segregation, systemic oppression. so in a way, I felt as though I was representing the genuine US, a country that I do love. And I take these stands and protest out of a passion for it to be better. And to feel the USOPC support in Tokyo, because this was the first games where they did offer the full support of athletes protesting, was huge for me. And I do hope, kind of as I was saying before, I am a bit of a precedent for the Paralympic side of things. I hope that this can encourage other people to protest, to speak up, to use their voice, to use that freedom of expression, because at the end of the day, in those fleeting moments, it is one of the only things that we have is our voice.
Awesome. No, thank you, Charley, for continuing and sharing those important statements about what does it mean to have America have your back, and what does it mean to be a human. And so without much more, I'm going to turn it over to Yannick to kind of reflect on this question, but also just to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. I'll take it in a little bit of a different direction, and I'll put on my professor hat a little bit, because, you mentioned, Eli, America having athletes back. And if we look at the history of not just the United States, but like other countries having athletes back, especially when it comes to minoritized athletes, Black athletes, LGBTQ athletes, even athletes with disabilities, their countries haven't had their backs. If we think of sport, sport is one of the things we have in society that are deeply rooted in systemic injustices, inequities. We have kind of created this myth that sport is somehow a neutral space, and that politics and protest should stay out of sports. Whereas, scholars who study this, athletes who are members of minoritized groups say that sport has never been a neutral space. It has always been a site of struggle for members of minoritized groups. If you think about, some of the biggest examples of social justice leadership in sport, we think of the Olympic or Paralympic Games. We think of people like John Carlos, Tommy Smith, Jesse Owens, right? Sport has never been a space that is neutral. One of the sentences that we included in our recommendation on Rule 50 that really stuck with me, and I remember reading that sentence out loud and people really, responding to that in very powerful emotional ways, was that the ability to stay neutral in times of oppression is really an expression of privilege that is only granted to those in whose image the games have been created. And those are white, straight, able-bodied men. So anybody who doesn't fit those characteristics historically had to struggle for visibility, for belonging, for seeing value in themselves in the Olympic and Paralympic movement. So when we talk about broader issues of freedom of expression and the right to protest, we always have to think about that sport has historically been a super conservative space where the powers that be systemically try to silence athletes, especially those from minoritized populations like Black athletes, who oftentimes have been at the forefront of social justice movements. So obviously I'm really passionate about this, and I come from this from a very different perspective, but I always try to remind people, and this goes from the students I teach in my classes, which I see some of them online, so I want to give them a shout out, thanks for joining, to working with the leaders in the Olympic and Paralympic movement, that we always have to remember that sport is not a neutral space, and if we remain silent, if we don't do anything against those systems of oppression, we actually strengthen them. We actually make it worse. There's no such thing as being neutral and being inactive. We have to be proactive in this work, which is why people like me and Moushaumi and Charley and Raven Saunders and Race and Gwen are so outspoken on these issues, because we can't afford to stay silent, because if we just leave the system as is, we're just reinforcing some of the inequities that has some really real severe consequences for some people in our country, again, especially those from minoritized populations. So one of the things I really want to highlight in this context when we think about freedom of expression and protest is, because a lot of people think that sport is a neutral, apolitical space, the change that we created in the Olympic and Paralympic movement in the United States is historic. Sometimes I forget that it's so impactful, but what Charley mentioned, that the USOPC did 180 on Rule 50 and Section 2.2. Up until 2019, they said you can raise your voice, you can protest. So some of the work that Moushaumi and the other athletes, the experts and I have done, it's really led to some historic changes in the US Olympic and Paralympic movement. So for us really going into Tokyo, the question wasn't whether or not athletes are going to protest. We knew that. We knew going in that there's going to be athletes speaking up. For us, the question was, will the USOPC, not just talk the talk, but walk the walk? Will they, stick to their word to no longer sanction athletes? And the showdown that was about to happen was, what is the USOPC going to do when the IOC or IPC impose sanctions and they expect the USOPC to, carry those forward? So that was really the crucial question for us heading into Tokyo. And again, Moushaumi will attest to this. I am one of the most critical voices in the room with the USOPC. I cannot say enough positive things about how the USOPC has responded to these protests. They have walked the walk, as Charley said. They have supported the athletes. They have, said that they stand by their decision not to sanction athletes, and they have expressed that decision to the IOC and IPC. Which, I don't want to speculate, but the responses from those bodies to the protests we saw this summer definitely indicate a changing climate, at least a little bit. So I just want to, underline that when we think about freedom of expression and the right to protest, we are at a historic crossroads, not just in this country, but globally. And it's because of people like Charley and Moushaumi that the tide seems to be shifting. Now, as a, social justice strategies, I tend to be more, pessimistic when it comes to change. So I don't want to be too excited, but also, we can't deny that this moment is very unique. And heading into the Beijing Games, this is going to be even more prominent with some of the human rights abuse that going on in the host country over there. So I just want to highlight those aspects.
Excellent. Thank you, Yannick. It's excellent to keep us going. I did actually want to, before we move into a little bit on the future, I did want to, two things. One, I want to encourage our attendees. I mentioned at the top, we're using the Q&A. So feel free to share your comments, your questions, use that Q&A, and then we'll be engaging around that. Before we move to the future, I did want to ask Moushaumi and Charley if you'd like to respond or share more on that point about neutrality, because I do think that's an essential point. So if there's anything you'd like to kind of reflect on or share back following Yannick's comments before we move into our next section on the future. And then Moushaumi or Charley, anything you'd like to add to that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That assumption that sport is neutral and that everyone is entering on a level playing field is just incredibly inaccurate. I'll speak on rowing because that's obviously what I'm most familiar with, but there wasn't a single person of color in our final, and it's like, that's not a coincidence. Rowing is one of the least diverse sports at the Olympics, at the Paralympics. So again, this assumption that it's all neutral, everything's good once we get to the village. And I appreciate that idealism of the Olympic village, the Paralympic village being that kind of representation of what the world could be. It's great. And to a certain degree, I do buy into it, but you also have to be realistic of where the world currently is and where your country is and where the United States are. And I feel as though it would have been irresponsible for me to go there and to just be like, this is great, wave the US flag around and be just really excited. And although I did have some of those feelings, again, to disregard what's really going on in our country and to not use my voice, I felt as though it was irresponsible. And again, especially looking across the line in the A final and seeing no people of color, no representation. Again, it was really moving. So it was like, wow, this isn't a neutral playing field. This podium isn't diverse, and that's the result of years and years and years of oppression, of racism. And it's tragic because I do think rowing would be such a better sport if it was more inclusive. And that was one of actually the really encouraging things about protesting is so many people of color and minorities within the sport all throughout the world reached out and were like, hey, I really appreciate you using your voice. It really empowered me. And that in turn empowered myself. So I think it's important to continue to combat that narrative that it's all neutral and it's all good once we get to the village, because it's not very representative of what's actually going on.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I just appreciate I have to be organic and authentic when I say it takes the conversation from individuals who do not look like me. It takes the white male, the Caucasian male, to have that real conversation in some of these spaces. And that's what Dr. Yannick did. I share the stories. It's been my lived experience. And everyone that looks like me in America, we have a lived experience of being disenfranchised, marginalized. And I like to remind people that the word equality and equity are very different. And space cannot be neutral because when you don't have equity, you not only have inequalities, you have iniquities. And when you speak on having neutral spaces, a neutral space is a space where you would believe there are no iniquities. And when you're talking about coming together and finding where everyone can have the access, everyone can be included, and particularly talking about the United States of America, that is all we are. What makes our country an amazing country that I represented in 2004 in Athens, Greece, where I can tell you, those who yelled for me in USA did not so much look like me and my parents as much as they look like you all who are on this panel with me, and they are much my compatriots and my family, right? And so it was important that we share these stories authentically, and you have to hear it. You have to hear it, and everyone has to speak on the truth and what is right. It's about humanity, because where there are iniquities in one space, they're going to inevitably show up in another space. It's just going to happen. And when you don't tackle those things, you start to see that effect. I can tell you, Dr. Yannick kind of gives you the light version of what that midnight hour looked like before going into the games. And I'll expand on it just a little bit. It was intense. I would say we were on the line, maybe 9 days out from opening ceremonies. And is that a generous, would I say 9 or maybe 2 weeks, maybe? I think 2 weeks may be generous. And it was still, the IOC was not understanding, which was making it difficult for the USOPC to really understand why they had to take that leadership role, not back down, be strong in there, stay in the forefront, speak on what the athletes talked about. And, it takes those phone calls. And I can tell you, I had a very, I can say for all that has come together, the conversation I had with Sarah Hirschland before we came back to the council and spoke with our legal counsel, those, sometimes you have to get really personal. You have to get into the deep. You have to have people see you. You have to get to a level of vulnerability in this work to show up for everyone, and sometimes that's difficult. And in order to really be successful and be impactful, you have to be able to share. And the beautiful part about Sarah in leadership, she had to be able to step outside of her shell, listen, accept, and understand. And oftentimes when it comes to this area and these conversations, we listen. We often may not accept, and rarely we've not been understanding. And so if we are able to do those things, we can get to a very special place. And I can tell you in this conversation, we were very candid in the unit with our legal department, and just shared about, follow the money, follow the viewership. People want to see American athletes there, and we cannot allow the IOC or anyone to tell us that where we have freedom of speech, we can't go represent our country as well-respected patriots and go have the same thing and that be trusted and be supported, because we've already been supported. And, we started to unpack that, and it got real. Dr. Yannick just kept pushing back about the complacency and being complicit in behavior if you don't take a strong stance, if you don't call it out. And by the time we got done, I know exactly the day. It was July the 2nd, when all the Americans, and you know what, let me point this out. I made a very interesting point, but it was pertinent to Sarah. And I said to Sarah, in all this work, we allowed the IOC, after we've spoken on the recommendations, given a global love to how we can really bring the world together, they further sanction, besides the language of not having a fist and kneeling, because that is what I was adamant about changing that language. They further added not being able to wear anything that said Black Lives Matter. And that's when I became personally offended. Like before, it was about we're tackling it. But it was like, we do all this work. We bring these recommendations. Everybody's been at the table. And not only do you all not update them to change, you turn the dagger that's already there and you want us to get on a plane and bring in the billions of dollars in the viewerships and make the Tokyo Games great. And I let her know that doesn't add up for the US American. That doesn't add up for the American. Like, you know, that's not who we are branded as a people, and we just can't move in that space. And it was July the 2nd at 11 a.m. while we were all getting ready for our 4th of July, that I think Dr. Yannick, we received the email and they released the updates of new recommendations to Rule 50. And I was very pleased when I looked at my phone to see that they'd taken away a fist or kneeling being a part of those, you know, just take the language out altogether. And they left it on a case-by-case basis in terms of dealing with the NOCs individually, because I knew if we could get them to understand, do it that way, for the US athletes, we would be protected and covered. And I'm just so happy to hear all the support. To hear Charley's conversation just about the support he's been getting, that lets me know that here on this soil, we're getting it. And I love the fact that as athletes, the very thing that unites us, sport, can vibrate amongst our countrymen, and we can kind of get this wave of understanding how beautiful we are as humans and what was needed to be celebrated. So that was something that was very special, but it got intense.
Well, no, well, thank you so much. So thank you all for sharing such really important stories, and also just the fact that this is about human decisions. You know, people are making these decisions, and just how much it is about these honest and open conversations. So no, just this chance to just have this conversation together and to kind of help kind of go behind the curtain a little bit of our stories and these experiences. I do want to just be able to take a few minutes, and we're getting a few questions. We're going to keep encouraging folks to share questions and comments. Please use the Q&A. But I do want to do a round, and we'll start with Charley this time, and just a couple minutes each, you know, but just to share a little bit for your thoughts for the future, you know, as we're thinking, like, you know, Beijing and then Paris, and but also not only in the Olympics and sport and society, you know, how do you see the future? Do you have a kind of a vision of some possibilities? Do you see continued hurdles? Kind of what are some of your thoughts or recommendations for the future? So we'll just do maybe a couple minutes each, and then we'll really get into some, as we're wrapping up, some of the questions we're getting in. So we'll start with Charley, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a bit of an optimist. And I think if anything, the last 2 years have reinforced that a bit, especially on the USOPC side. I think the USOPC has done an amazing job. Again, just speaking from personal experience and watching them kind of walk back their stances that they held in 2019. I think that's an awesome place to start and an awesome kind of launching point for continued growth going into this next cycle, going into the Beijing Games. I'm very interested, kind of as Dr. Yannick did mention, there is a lot going on in China as far as human rights abuses. I'll be interested to see if athletes choose to protest, how that will go about, because it now is potentially going to be directed at a host country on host country soil. So we'll see. I do think I'm a bit optimistic, as Moushaumi was also speaking on the IOC, kind of walking back Rule 50 just a little bit. It's a step in the right direction. Section 2.2 also a little bit. I'm interested myself to see the kind of precedent I set with the Paralympics, protesting on the podium, if that has a lasting effect. I mean, a little selfishly, what the potential repercussions are going to be for myself, because that's still a little bit out. There's still investigations going on with that. But I do feel optimistic, and I do feel as though steps are being taken in the right direction, but it's very important not to take them for granted and not to just kind of feel like, oh, we've made this progress just because of course we make progress. We're progressive people. Like, no, there's so much work, so much hard work, so many hours have been put in to getting to where we are now. And there is so much further to go. And it's important to appreciate the fact that just because where we are now and we have grown a bit, doesn't mean that the next step will naturally come. It's going to take work. It's going to take a lot of conversations. It's going to take a lot of phone calls, writing emails, protesting, everything to continue to force both the IOC and the IPC's hand in catching up with the changing world, in appreciating who we are as people, the rights we have to freedom of speech, and the rights we have to using that podium that we earned to take a stand for what we believe in. So I guess long story short, I'm optimistic, curious to see what's going to happen. Hopefully it heads in the right direction, but we're going to have to work for it no matter what happens.
Well, thank you, Charlie. And we'll go to Yannick, and then we'll give Moushaumi kind of the final word before we move into the wrap up. Yeah, go ahead, Yannick.
Absolutely. Earlier I said I'm more of a pessimist, but the very nature of my work also requires me to be optimistic at times. And I refuse to believe that every single person can be a part of driving change. That's one thing I've learned over the past 10 years doing this work. And for me, if I think about what's the future of this issue and the movement, I think a lot of the kind of spotlight right now is on Rule 50 and Section 2.2, but those rules, those policies are just reflections of larger systems that disadvantage athletes from certain groups, minoritized groups. So, one of the things I always try to highlight is that even with the USOPC Council, the Rule 50 work gets like the most, spotlight because it had the biggest, most visible impact. But behind the scenes with the council, we've been working on really fundamentally changing the Olympic and Paralympic movement in the US, which will have, send shockwaves across the world, I'm hoping. But we are about to release our fourth recommendation that is focused on anti-racism and acts of discrimination specifically. We just released one on institutional awareness and cultural change. And the work we are mapping out there is, again, getting at the very roots of the issues, from the very grassroots level all the way to the elite level that we see in the Olympic and Paralympic Games. So when we talk about the future of these issues, I'm hoping that we can continue to drive some of those changes, that folks look at those recommendations we put out, really use them to fundamentally change the way we view sport, we view access to sport, we view belonging and fulfillment in sport. So I definitely hope that that's going to happen. And then, specifically on freedom of expression and the right to protest, again, I want to be cautiously optimistic that I think the IOC and IPC are slowly realizing that, just like other sports organizations, that we are in a different time, that it's just not okay to ignore these issues anymore. And part of that is, all of us applying as much pressure as we can on those governing bodies to create the change we want to see. That's the work that, Eli and I did over the summer with the open letter with, the over 150 experts. We know the IOC and IPC weren't going to read this letter and be like, oh, awesome, thank you, we'll change Rule 50 tomorrow. That wasn't the goal. It was to get our voice out there and start the dialogue. So, in 6 months from now, they're going to change the rules. And 2 years from now, they're going to change the rule. So it's really about all of us applying pressure on those bodies, getting the sponsors to apply pressure. That's going to be huge. That's going to be a huge focus of our work moving forward to, get those who give money to the movement to put pressure on them to change those restrictive, biased rules. So if we think about the future of the Olympic and Paralympic movement, those are some changes I want to see. And then lastly, and then I'll shut up. One of the strengths of our work is that the US voice is, pretty united on these issues, which is not, a given. But one of the drawbacks of this is that the US voice is the loudest voice in the room globally when it comes to athlete expression and protest. And that is very important, but also in the United States, the concept of freedom of expression is very, very different than even it's globally, like through the UN or other, internationally recognized bodies, how they conceptualize freedom of expression. So when we talk about the future, I'm also hoping that more of the other national Olympic committees, those who don't have as much visibility, will join us in this work and show that it's not just a US issue. These are global issues where we just happen to be the most powerful voice right now, but we need more NLCs and NPCs to join this dialogue to put pressure on the IOC and IPC. Moushaumi, back to you.
The global aspects. Yeah, Moushaumi, over to you, and then.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Yannick hit it on the head. I mean, when we started, we understood that we had an opportunity to put things in place that can shape and change the globe, and change for athletes. At the grassroots level all the way through. And so I think what's important in looking into the future, the work that Charley's talking about in the conversations and, you know, keeping everyone's feet to the fire is so very important. And what I would love to see just even in our delegation, so that we can continue to be examples of leadership. And because we had the platform, for me, we had to have the conversation. So as the US delegation, there are some conversations we have to have and lead globally in a different way, in a way that brings other nations to use models and roadmaps best they can for their spaces. So what I would like to see is for us to even start to streamline and come together with all the different demonstrations, all the different ideologies and viewpoints and feelings of athletes, so that when we go to the Olympic and Paralympic Games, that when we have our podium moments, that some of the things that we all are centered around, we can highlight those things collectively, you know, under kind of one token or one tone, and to bring even more visibility in a way that other countries, like Dr. Yannick was saying, other NOCs can gravitate, you know, if it's a shirt that all of us are wearing, right, for Charley, if it's, you know, let's find out each other's movements and let's really band together. Now that we have this space, let's streamline the space and really tackle issues collectively together for each other, you know. And I think that that's really going to be the best way to move forward. One of the things I do want to say in terms of what Dr. Yannick was saying and the work that's done, yes, all of the highlight went around the demonstrations and the recommendations on, recommendations on protests and demonstrations. But the recommendations that we put out about athletes' right to expression, athlete expression and rights, the institutional change and awareness, and our last recommendation on racism and discrimination. The most beautiful part about the work that we've done with respect to that America and the US athlete coming together, you're getting brilliant minds. And then we chose beautiful experts from our country who have been born and bred in some of the most awesome experiences that they can bring to the conversation, that they can really add value to help us write and scope the direction that we need to go in. And when people see these recommendations, and I would employ every organization on US soil, every business, every school district, every level of government entity, to read every single recommendation in its entirety and find a way to change your organization and find out what fits. When I tell you it is a blueprint, it is a roadmap. And I would say the universe brought some unique people together at this appointed time with the right frame of mind and that energy that Charley has. I'm just thankful that the athletes are going to be just as ignited as he is, because the space is there, the platform is there, the work does need to be done, but it can be done. And I'm a glass half full person, right? So I'm not going to say there's a pessimistic part. I'm going to say this: when the work gets heavy for us, we have to always stick to the why, because when you can understand your why, the how doesn't seem so heavy. You just kind of keep getting at the how, right? And for me, I hope that people understand that the why is that we can't see sport in these beautiful moments of human beings globally and not recognize the unity is to see the human past the shell and really the spirit that's within, so that we can truly enjoy what it is that we're watching. Because if you miss that, you can't really enjoy any other sport. And hopefully that ignites a greater and better world for all of us, right? So, you know, and going forward, for everything that everyone said, I just hope that people do employ their organizations, read those recommendations, reach out to Dr. Yannick, reach out to our experts, reach out to athletes, you know, have the conversation, because it's a lot that can happen.
Awesome. No, I think your point about the magic of the people coming together and that power and the moment we're in. And so thank you, Moushaumi, for those words. And I know we had a couple of folks that raised their hands, and I was encouraging folks to, so I think it was Camden and Franziska. If you do have comments, you know, please use the Q&A. And there is one of the questions that I've been having around is sort of this next generation question and the youth. You know, how are we getting the youth of school age and kind of that generation really moving on these questions. So kind of leave that. But I guess for the sake of time, we have a couple more minutes. There's a question here from Sandeep that I think we'll probably focus on, but maybe if you wanted to touch on the youth aspects as well. How do you think protection or rights for athletes doing activism can be better implemented really around the world, particularly developing countries, because they don't have jobs or avenues of making life? If they're banned, then that is their livelihood. There's that line of question about some of the risks and limitations, if you will. So, and we can go for a couple more minutes. We are going to begin to wrap up, but Yannick, Moushaumi, Charley, any sort of brief responses on that question? It's a really good one.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I mean, that's such an important question. And what I was going to say is, for me, what is important is that we start to align sponsors, we start to align corporations, entities that really support this globally and understand the athletes. So when it comes to countries that are less developed in terms of protection and rights, we can rely and pull from resources in these spaces to really support these athletes in these ways and really start focusing on, like Dr. Yannick said, to come together so we can know the needs, right? But globally, find the supportive mechanisms to start to be able to see what would be the need of the athletes and where can we pull those resources, so that, because there are tons of organizations, tons of entities, tons of businesses, tons of sponsors who use our logos in these different developing countries that will support athletes who are willing to. And I think it's about aligning the right people together to identify them with athletes who, before that even happens, and have that already set in place. So that really be proactive instead of reactive. So I think that's an amazing question, because that's something that we definitely have been understanding and knowing from the beginning, that when we set this forward, we're going to really have to continue to work. And that's what Dr. Yannick spoke to, bringing the NOCs in and all of us having that conversations so we can really dive deep into how we can do that for everyone and secure that space.
Yeah, Yannick.
Charley, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I was just going to agree with that. I mean, I definitely recognize that coming from the U.S. and coming from such a progressive governing body such as the USOPC, it is a place of privilege, to know that the governing body behind me being there is in support of it. And it's a very interesting and tough, challenging question. What do you do for countries that might not have that support for athletes, that maybe their livelihood is dependent on this sport and potentially another cycle? And Moushaumi, I think it's a great point, is a lot of the times if you follow the money, that is the source of a lot of these things. So if you could find ways to financially support these athletes, whether it be through sponsorships, whether it be through endorsements, outside of just their respective governing bodies, that could be a huge way of kind of freeing them a little bit of whatever restrictions that they might have imposed on them, knowing that they have some sort of financial security coming back. And I think a large part of that would be convincing these corporations that this is something to invest in. This is the new thing, so to speak, is being socially aware, using your voice to speak up. And again, that's something I hope I've done a little bit. I know a lot of other athletes have done in the past, and it is something that's changing. So I do hope that some athlete from a developing country can feel, that they can speak up, and hopefully someone will back them, even if it's not coming from their home country. So I guess, Dr. Yannick, if you had something else to say on it too, that I just agree with Moushaumi. That's a great point.
Some final words here for Yannick.
Yeah, absolutely. All good points. One of the things I want to highlight too is that this idea that, athletes are being stripped of their livelihood, that's actually not foreign to the United States. If you think about what happened to Gwen Berry, she lost 80% of her sponsorships after she protested. So, I just want to highlight that as well. It's such an important question, Sandeep. I'm so glad you bring that up. And part of the issue is that most of the developing countries just haven't been at the table, and even those conversations, because again, the more industrialized countries are just so much more powerful in their voices in the space, unfortunately. So I think part of the issue here is that's on the IOC and IPC to change, the policies and procedures they have in place to make it easier for NOCs in developing countries to punish athletes for speaking up, starting with Rule 50 and Section 2.2. So I think this is where this institutional change comes in the Olympic and Paralympic movement, that the IOC and IPC have to change as an organization to protect athletes who want to speak out. That's on them. That's on these organizations, these national governing bodies, to create the protections for the athletes should they be, willing to speak out, that they can't be retaliated against by the National Olympic Committees. We got a long ways to go when it comes to that, but I'm hoping that, with the conversation we are starting right now, that a lot more of those countries will join and, make their voices heard, because they face very unique challenges compared to the United States or Germany or the UK or other, Western countries. So yeah, I really appreciate the question.
Well, good. Well, thank you. Thank you all so much for this kind of conversation, dialogue we've had over the last hour. We'll go ahead and, wrap it up here. But yeah, I just want to, hopefully there'll be more and more chances for these kind of conversations and, reflections and thinking forward, and the chances to inspire that next generation, which is really what it's all about. So we're going to just sort of wrap up here. The next Beyond the Field will be December 1st. We'll be doing our second one of the semester. We're going to be focusing particularly on sort of a national level initiatives, whether that's with regard to how different governments address sport, not only in the United States, but around the world, looking at ministries of sport and secretaries of sport. And so we're going to kind of take a look at those dimensions, and then look at how does the US approach that in the models that we have in the US. So hopefully folks will come back for that conversation. But again, we're going to go ahead and close out here. We'll stick around just informally for a minute or two, and then we'll sign off. So I want to thank everyone for joining today. And hope you all have a good rest of your evening. And again, thank you to our amazing panelists, Yannick, Charley, Moushaumi, and thank you, of course, to the Human Rights Institute and UConn Sport Management as well. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and close out. Thank you all so much. We look forward to being in touch real soon. Awesome. Good. Thank you. Thank you all so much. We'll put our screen back up here. Good. Yep. Getting some thank you comments coming in. Well, good. I'll go ahead and close out here, but have a great rest of your night, and I'll do some follow up on email. Thank you, Charley. Thank you, Moushaumi.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, guys. It's been a privilege.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. See ya.
Thank you. Good night.